Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Yeah, do please move and turn around. My name's Paul, as you heard. I'm now a resident of Cromer for the last 12, 13 years. But I am a Norfolk boy. I was born in Dersingham. An aunt of mine had a big house at Sandringham that you might well have heard of. And my father and grandfather were both career policemen in the Metropolitan Police, but our family moved en masse from the East End of London to sunny Hunstanton just after the war, and then to Dersingham, where I was born, and then to King's Lynn, where I spent all of my childhood. But you know how beautiful King's Lynn is. I couldn't wait to get out of the place at the age of 18, and never came back until we retired. And doing what I did, when you retire, you can't stay where you've been. So we ended up here back in Norfolk and came to Cromer in 2011. I've been a magistrate now for 32 years, and I find it fascinating who comes to listen to my talks and who doesn't come. So if you're here this morning, I'm assuming that you've come with a relatively clear conscience, probably very little experience of courts, but I shall say no more about that. You do need to know a number of things. I'm just going to explain this morning, I hope briefly, about the justice system in this country and how it works, and what it is that I do within that as an individual. But the big question, of course, that we always ask a defendant in the dock is, how do you plead? Guilty or not guilty? Well, let's explore together what magistrates do. So this morning I just want to take you on a little journey to explore the work of a magistrate. You need to understand that first of all, in this country, magistrates hear 97% of all cases that are charged. Anybody who's charged with any offence, that case will begin its life in a magistrate's court. Now, if you're going to ask me what about the other 3% of cases, I haven't got a clue. But most of those, I guess, are very serious matters that may well go straight to Crown Court. And when I say serious matters, I'm talking about treasonable matters, for which, incidentally, the death penalty still exists in this country. So if you're thinking of committing treason and you want to come to the next men's breakfast, could you just put off doing it, please? But in this country, all cases begin their life before magistrates. And we hear, therefore, all sorts of cases, ranging from being drunk in charge of a pedal cycle. Yeah, I've had those, and we have a famous Cromer resident I've dealt with more than once who's been charged with being drunk in charge of his mobility scooter. He's frequently arrested with a half-empty bottle of spirits in the wicker basket in the front of his mobility scooter. So very minor things like that, and magistrates hear cases right up to people charged with murder. And yes, I've had them as well. I remember in my second week ever years ago, I was confronted with an Indian man who was charged with murdering his wife with a vacuum cleaner. I whispered to the chair of the bench, can we ask which of the attachments he used? But we never found out. So, what do magistrates have to do? Well, we have first of all to decide on a number of things. One of the principles of justice in this country is that you should be tried by your peers, which is why we have a lay magistracy. People imagine that as a magistrate you're a highly trained legal beagle. Let me disavow you of that. We are not. We are there to represent the community in its administration of justice. Now, there is a lot of training to undergo, but essentially magistrates are not legally qualified people. But one of the things that magistrates do that nobody else in the justice system does, including judges, is decide on matters of guilt or innocence. Magistrates are unique in that regard. And it really is an enormous responsibility if you are listening to the trial of someone who's entered a plea of not guilty to the charge, to hear the evidence and to make a finding of guilt or innocence. Magistrates also decide on sentences. I'll come back to that. Magistrates decide on allocation of cases. And again, I'll explain this in a minute, but you may be aware that in this country we have different tiers of courts. Magistrates are required to make findings on restrictions imposed on defendants. If the case cannot be completed on that day, then the case will be adjourned to another day, and the defendant will be required to be released on bail conditions to ensure that not only do they behave themselves between now and then, but that they return to court as well. So magistrates are required to decide on whether it's safe to release someone back into the community, or whether what they are charged with is so serious that they must be remanded into custody. And therefore magistrates make findings and determinations about bail and the conditions that may be imposed on someone before the case comes back. So what is a magistrate? Well, the chances are that you bump into magistrates quite frequently, but you don't know it. This is a bit of an enigma, but we are under a requirement to keep under the radar and not to expose ourselves. In other words, not to tell people that you are a magistrate. Now, being one of the magistrates that does public talks, that's quite tricky. But you will understand, I hope, that one of those requirements is necessary, because there are people who think that being a magistrate somehow you've become a person of great importance in the community. Let me tell you that that's not the case, well, not as far as I'm concerned. A magistrate is, however, a justice of the peace. You are allowed to put the letters JP after your name. Now, some people think that's wonderful, others of us think, so what? But there we are. Justices of the peace were founded back in the 12th, 13th century as keepers of the peace within the country and within the community. And because magistrates are lay people, they are community representatives. And magistrates are appointed, hopefully, from right across the social spectrum. Now, I was explaining to some of my friends on the table here that it's really quite difficult getting that representation of community onto the bench. For some years, I served on the committee that actually interviewed people who have applied to become magistrates. And of course, one of the things that we have to do is tick all the boxes about diversity. Now, here in Norfolk, that's quite tricky. And the only way that truly we could tick the diversity box here in Norfolk was by appointing somebody from Suffolk. That's diversity for you. But a magistrate is a justice of the peace, a community representative, and above all should be an upholder of the law. Now, I'm not going to embarrass you by asking how many of you here this morning have ever been stopped for speeding, but put your hand up if you have. Wow! Well, thank you for helping the national debt in that regard. That's very good of you. I don't condone speeding, but I'm not quite sure how people get through their driving careers without getting caught for speeding, and I join with you in that. So do understand that magistrates are not whiter than white. I thought recently that any time I got had up for speeding, I had to tell the Lord Chancellor, but apparently now we're allowed to have 9 points on our licence before he wants to know about us. So be it. But more seriously, I was trained years ago by a very learned clerk to the justices who had this maxim, that as magistrates we are not here to help, we're not a social agency, we are here to do justice. And it's determining what that means that is the difficult bit. In the United Kingdom, there are some 13,000 magistrates. When I started 32 years ago, we had 33,000 magistrates. So you will see that the workload has increased exponentially. We are lay and unpaid. I do not get paid for doing it. And you may well ask, well, why do I do it then? Well, I do it because of the previous slide. Because I believe it's worth doing and worth doing well. We do get paid our travel, and we get paid a daily allowance for subsistence. If I tell you that in the last 15 years, not only have those allowances not increased, but in fact they've decreased, you will understand that we're probably all mad by doing this. But there we are. Magistrates are male or female, and we're represented in about equal proportions on the bench, aged between 18 and 75. We do have a number of magistrates newly appointed in their 20s. Don't put this on record, and if you can take this bit off the recording, I'd be grateful. But I'm not keen on appointing magistrates who are in their early 20s, simply because I believe that you need to have some experience of life and people to be able to do the job. But there again, we're ticking the diversity boxes by doing that. And they've recently increased the age at which you have to hang up your boots to 75 because we've had a shortage of people able and available to do it. But magistrates come from all backgrounds across the community. Magistrates now are appointed after application and interview. Years ago, you could only become a magistrate by being recommended by an existing magistrate. You will understand the weakness of that system. I think that so easily the magistracy became, and I'll use the phrase carefully, an old boys' club. But now, and for the last many years, you can actually apply to become a magistrate. And that's what I did in 1991. I applied. I was looking for something else to do that ran alongside my work as a pastor. Now, being a pastor is more than 24/7, but I needed some kind of release from that. And with a father and grandfather who'd been in the police, awareness of the law and its processes had always been part of my background. So I applied, and the day came when I went for my interview. To be met in the interview room by two people. I have no idea who the second person was, because he never spoke and was never allowed to. But the first person was the redoubtable Lady Popplewell. I don't know if the name means anything to you, but the Popplewell family have been big in public service in this country for generations. Lady Popplewell's husband was a Lord Justice of Appeal. And she said, "Oh, come in and sit down." And her first words to me were these: "Oh, I see you're a reverend. When can you start?" And I sat there thinking, you haven't asked me anything yet. Obviously, she still came from the old school. But there, much against their better judgment, they appointed me. And I started sitting, and I spent 20 years adjudicating in courts in Thames Valley, in Milton Keynes, and in Aylesbury. And in 2011, end of 2011, having moved now to Cromer, I started sitting here in Norfolk, mostly in Norwich, although I also sit in the courts in Great Yarmouth and in King's Lynn, not all at the same time, you'll understand. So, what do magistrates do? Well, first of all, magistrates serve and sit in magistrates' courts, and I'll come in just a moment to explain about them. There are other courts that are implicit within and involved in the system as well, so magistrates will also be found in family courts. I sit too in family courts, and we'll explain in a moment what's different about those. Family courts geographically sit in magistrates' courts in any case. Also, if the defendant is under the age of 16, there's a dedicated group of magistrates who serve in youth courts. But magistrates also sit in Crown courts. And we go and sit in Crown courts on appeals. Just at this moment, I'm in the middle of a 2-day appeal hearing in the Crown Court in Norwich. It got adjourned for various reasons. But it will illustrate how much the system is in crisis. I'm listening to the appeal of a defendant against his conviction, convicted in 2020. And we're now in 2024, and the appeal's just come up and has been adjourned again. We used to have a principle of summary justice. Whatever happened to that, I lament that. But all magistrates are appointed by the Lord Chancellor. Now, you'll all be able to, this is a political appointment, this guy's a politician, and you'll all be able to tell me who our current Lord Chancellor is. Haven't a clue, yeah, that's part of his name, yes? Sure. Excellent, well done, sir. Have an extra piece of toast, it's gone hard, but you can have it. The Right Honourable Alex Chalk, KC, MP, Lord Chancellor, and Secretary of State for Justice. Now, Lord Chancellors tend to change when their socks get a bit smelly, which is quite frequently. So let's play a little game, shall we? Let's see how good you are with previous Lord Chancellors. All these people have been Lord Chancellors recently. Who's that? Liz Truss. Well done. You've probably heard of her for reasons that escape me. Mr. Gove. I have to say to Mr. Gove's defence, he's been one of the more effective Lord Chancellors we've had. He actually did something positive. Who was that?
Know the face.
You know the face, but can't remember the name. He was Minister of Transport, yes. He's got a wonderful reputation. Whatever post he's been appointed to, he's monumentally cocked it up. I'll say that because Duncan's not here this morning.
It's Grayling.
Chris Grayling, well done. Yeah. You remember this guy? Ken Clark. He was a Norwich MP, yes. No, that was Charles Clark.
This is Charles Clark.
Yeah, and you remember this guy? I have to tell you, he was never Lord Chancellor for this reason. So there we are. Yes, political appointments. So come with me then. Let's go. Oops, hang on. That's it. Let's go to court. Now, if you've never been to a magistrate's court, you are welcome to go and sit in the public gallery. You have to be over the age of 14. I remember on my eldest son's 14th birthday, he was desperate to go and watch his dad in court. So my wife Janet came along with him. Now I have to tell you that we very, very, very rarely get members of the public who just come and sit in the public gallery to watch what's going on, because it's usually fairly boring. But Janet went in with my son Tim, and the usher said to her, "Is your son on the list? Are you his mother?" And she quickly explained that no, they'd just come for the sheer fun of it, but there we are. So what do magistrates do? I wasn't expecting that slide. Next. Where are we? Oh, yeah. Okay. When you arrive at Magistrates' Court, you always identify the building by the royal crest that hangs up outside and hangs in every courtroom. You may be aware that in every courtroom there's a lot of bowing and scraping that goes on. That is because in this country we live in a constitutional monarchy. We do not live in an absolute monarchy. The king or the queen does not hold absolute power. They hold power because of the British Constitution. Now you would know that the British Constitution is a strange creature because it's not written down. But it is the Crown that is the arbiter of the law of this country. And the royal crest represents the power of the Crown. So any case that is charged, you may see that it is shown as being the Crown or the King versus Fred Blokes. It is the Crown that upholds the law. So every time you go into court and you see everybody bowing, they're not bowing to each other. Nobody's bowing to the magistrates, and the magistrates are not bowing to anybody else. we are bowing to the crown and representing, therefore, the power of the crown in matters of law. So, we go to a magistrate's court. Remember, that's where all cases begin. At the magistrate's court, depending on what someone is charged with, the case will either continue its life in that magistrate's court to its conclusion, or if it is more serious, it may be sent up to the next level, to Crown Court. Now in Norwich, the Crown Court is right next door to the Magistrates' Court. The buildings look very similar. If a case goes to Crown Court, and it is so serious that the appellant, the defendant, appeals the matter on a point of law, the case can be then transferred to the next level of court, which is the Court of Appeal. I'll come back to that again in a moment. But the Court of Appeal is located in London, and it's where all appeals are heard. Beyond the Court of Appeal, we now have the Supreme Court. Since Brexit, we have our own highest court in the land and no authority beyond that. So let's go back to the Magistrates' Court. There you'll see the Royal Crest outside. In the Magistrates' Court, you will find, first of all, a bench of magistrates. You'll see that there are 3. The law requires that bench be no more than 7. I've never sat on a bench of more than 3. It's possible to sit with a bench of 2, or even a bench of 1, or even a bench of none. And I'll explain that, I hope, in a moment. But it's important actually to have a bench with an odd number of people sitting on it, so that there will always be a majority. Every magistrate sits as an equal, but only the person who sits in the middle as the presiding justice has the right to speak in the court. Now, I've served as chairman of the bench, as a presiding justice, for nearly 30 years now. There's no rocket science in doing that, but you've jolly well got to be up to speed as to what's going on in the courtroom. And I have to be honest that as many times I've sat in court and thought to myself, what the dickens are they talking about? What's going on here? I presume they know, because sometimes I don't. The courts seem to employ a director of acronyms. And they'll fire off acronyms left, right and centre, and you're not always sure what they mean. But there's the bench. They will hear the case, and they will determine it. At the next level of court up, of course, in the Crown Court, you get a judge and jury. Now, has anybody here ever been called to do jury service? Oh, quite a few. And of those of you who've been called to do jury service, how many of you actually got to do it? Okay, thank you. Because they will call a whole number of jurors. The defendant has the perfect right to look at a juror and reject them. And there is a limit to the number of objections that a defendant can raise to a juror without giving a reason. Thankfully, the American system's rather different to ours, but you'll be reading about the circus that's going on at the moment with Donald Trump and the jurors. Thank God we don't live in a country like that. But in the Crown Court, it is the jury who listen to the case and will make the determination of guilt or innocence. Never the judge. It is the judge's task to direct the jury and to carry out the function of sentencing. Beyond the Crown Court, as I said, is the Court of Appeal. Now, you may recognise that building. You sometimes see it on the news when there are famous cases. And quite recently, you may well have seen some of the sub-postmasters outside the Court of Appeal. I've actually sat on a case, not adjudicating on it. I won't go into the details of it because it's not very nice, but I had a client, let me say, pastorally, who took his case all the way to the Court of Appeal in London. He lost it and did a very lengthy sentence, but I found it fascinating to sit at the feet of the learned judges of appeal where all of them speak and ask questions. Here are some of the judges, and they become members of the Supreme Court in this country. And you can see here that there are the 12 members of the Supreme Court whose task is to determine the highest appeal cases in the land. So, going back to the Magistrates' Court, what happens there? Oh, the screen has gone blank on me. Here we are. Right. Cases in the Magistrates' Court, the powers of a magistrate are limited to imposing, first of all, a fine of up to £5,000, dependent on the nature of the case and its seriousness, or a period of imprisonment that's limited to 6 months imprisonment. Now, you can, as a magistrate, impose 12 months custody if you have a defendant who's charged with 2 linked offences that both attract custody. And just recently, the government decided that the prison population was reaching such a dangerous state that the delay in the system had become so awful that they doubled the powers of magistrates to impose periods of imprisonment for a single offence of up to 12 months in order to ease pressures on the system. That power lasted all of 3 weeks, and then they withdrew it again. Magistrates are under enormous pressure not to send people to prison, because our prison population is bursting at the seams. I sat this week and listened to the governor of Norwich Prison, Declan Moore, talking about this. Now, Declan is a superb man, and his words were these: do not listen to this tommy rot that's generated by the popular press that says that short prison sentences do not work. Let me tell you, he said, they do. And he said, I turn up for work first thing in the morning, and first thing in the morning, prisoners who are being released that day are standing at the gate with their bags of belongings, waiting to be picked up. And they see me coming and they say, morning, Gov. And then they turn around and look at Norwich Prison and say, that was one hell of a ride, I'm not coming back in here again. Let me tell you that for the vast majority of people, prison works. Of course, there are always the exceptions. And people are quite surprised to discover that, yes, I send people to prison. It's not an easy thing to do. I remember many years ago sitting with a new female magistrate. I can't remember what the defendant had done, but we retired to consider the sentence. And the bottom line was, he was going inside. And this lass broke down in tears and said, I can't do it. I can't do it. And she resigned her position on the spot. Now, it's not a pleasant thing to send somebody to prison. But yes, I do it. And I do it when it's required. But do understand this, that every case is unique. Magistrates have a whole series of sentencing guidelines, but they are only guidelines because this is a people business and every case is unique. So how unique are some of these cases? Well, let me tell you about Farmer Styles. I met him in the dock in Norwich Magistrates Court the very first day in January 2012 when I just moved here. I was chairing the court that morning. We'd already had to abandon the court because someone had left a note of a planted bomb in the men's loo. Obviously, they'd been in court earlier that day and weren't too impressed what we'd done with them. But anyway, back into court, and I met with Farmer Styles. Now, Farmer Styles hasn't got a farm, but he's a cattle trader. He goes around the county with his lorry buying and selling cattle. Now, DEFRA, the government organisation, had caught up with him because his paperwork wasn't up to date. So I said to him, Mr. Styles, why haven't you been keeping your paperwork up to date? Now, honestly, he leant over the dock and he said, well, boy, he said, that's like this. He said, my old missus, she used to do me paperwork, but she had a hysterectomy, so we got divorced. But she still comes round and cuts me hair. And you're sitting there thinking, What's this got to do with the case? Sadly, I think he probably couldn't read and write himself, and we dealt with it. More amusingly, I encountered an incompetent shoplifter one day in court. One Thursday, he'd gone into Boots in Norwich and stolen a gentleman's electric razor. So pleased was he with his exploits that the next day, the Friday, he went into Boots again and stole another gentleman's electric razor. And on the Monday of the next week, he went into Boots in Norwich and stole 2 gentlemen's electric razors. And we said to his solicitor, can you just explain to us why your client stole one on the Thursday, one on the Friday, but 2 on the Monday? And the solicitor went rather red and said, well, your worships, it's like this. By the time it got to the Monday, Boots had got a 2-for-1 offer. So, what happens in magistrates' courts? Well, there are different sorts of courts in the magistrates, and let's go to the adult criminal court first of all, where the approach is adversarial. Remember, it is the Crown versus whoever. So the task of the magistrates is basically to make a finding of what happened. Now you will know, of course, that when a defendant is called, or anybody is called forward to give evidence, they're invited into the witness box and they would take an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Sometimes I think what they mean is, if they're the defendant, I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and anything but the truth. Because what is the truth? It's so easy to sit there and listen to the prosecution and think to yourself, well, what can anybody say about this? And then you hear the defence and you think, oh, hang on a moment. Where is truth to be found in this? The approach is adversarial, therefore. The prosecution is brought by the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, the Crown Prosecution Service was set up in 1986 in this country to be the prosecuting authority. Before that time, it was the police that did the prosecutions. And part of my fascination with law is that my father was actually the police prosecutor in his final years of service. And he actually did the prosecutions in King's Lynn Magistrates Court. King's Lynn Magistrates Court used to be held in the old town hall on the Saturday marketplace in King's Lynn, and then it moved across the road to what was then the purpose-built courtroom. So my dad was actually the first prosecutor who prosecuted the very first case in that building. And when I go and sit there, I find it rather surreal to think that that's what he did. But the prosecutor will set before the court the outline of the facts of the case. Of course, in the court we also have the defendant. Unfortunately, in most courts now, you can tell the defendant because they're the only one not staring at a computer screen, but they stand there. Hopefully, the defendant may have a solicitor to represent them. You don't have to have a solicitor, but it's really quite helpful if you do. Also in the courtroom, they used to be called the court clerk, but they're now called the court legal advisor. The court legal advisor's task is to advise the bench on points of law. They are fully trained solicitors or barristers, and thank God for them, but that's their task. Also in the court you'll find the bench, who hopefully look a little bit more attractive than that. And also in the courtroom you may well find a probation officer. Now, the probation service was set up as an Anglican missionary organisation back in the 1800s to help defendants not re-offend. In time, that function was taken over by the government and was formalised into the probation service. The probation officer is worth their weight in gold in a court because their task is to advise the court, if the court so asks, on the defendant, on the background, on the circumstances of the offence, and to advise the court on suitable sentences, suitable disposals. My eldest son was a probation officer for 10 years. He then moved from that to head up a prison ministry nationally. He now lectures in the university in Derby on matters relating to the training of youth and community workers. For some years he was actually seconded out into counter-terrorism. Put the absolute wind up as to this day. We're not quite sure how many dark alleys he was down meeting offenders, but there we are. So in the magistrate's court, in the criminal court, if you go to a court, that's what you'll find there. Remember that courts also have other arenas and other functions, and one of those is the family court. Now, I've served in the family court for nearly 30 years as well. If in the criminal court the approach is adversarial, in the family court the approach is inquisitorial. In other words, we're not there trying to discern whether someone's guilty or innocent. In the family court, we are there to ask questions and to make findings and determinations that are for the ultimate welfare of the one person who never appears in that court, and that's the child. The welfare of the child is paramount. In the family court, we're dealing with two sorts of cases. First of all, public law cases that involve statutory agencies like the council, social services and children's services, where the safety and welfare of the child is at risk. More often, we're also in family court dealing with private law cases that are issues between related parties, between the parents, where there's been a breakdown of relationship. And when that happens, it's the child who is the biggest casualty. So in family court, we're dealing with a whole number of issues that relate to children. First of all, issues of child placement. Who should the child live with when the relationship is broken down? Now, that's not always the mother. Sometimes it's the father. But the court are required to make those findings on the evidence that are presented to them where the parties cannot agree of themselves. Also in family court, we're making determinations of cases where the child should go for adoption. Now, sadly, we don't practically do that now. That function is done by judges at the next level up. But certainly in my early days in family court, we would sit on adoption cases, and the final hearing of an adoption case is the most happy case of all. It's the only time in court where the whole family can come in, including the child, where you're allowed to take photographs, and we'd have a bit of a party in court because you would actually sign the final adoption order. And that really is a red letter day. I still see a young man whose adoption order I signed 20 odd years ago, and he never forgets that. More seriously and sadly, we're also dealing with issues of child welfare. We're also dealing with issues of child financial support. Hell hath no fury like the problem when two parents cannot agree. And so often money becomes a weapon between separated parties. We're also dealing with issues of parental declaration. Sometimes, if the parties have not been married, father may not appear on the birth certificate. And the court may need to determine whether in fact he is the parent of the child. Now, there's only one way you can do that, that's by the ordering of a DNA test. That's not cheap. And I shall never forget a case in Milton Keynes where we had one of our very famous solicitors who stood up one day in the middle of one of these cases and asked for an adjournment. And very puzzledly we said, why? And he went very red and said, well, I have to confess, I've just lost the results of the DNA test. The problem was there were 5 children involved, each from different fathers. So that was 5 DNA tests, £600 times 5, gone down the Swanee. But we're required to make findings of parental declaration and parental responsibility. Again, if parents have not been married, father's not on the birth certificate, the court may be required to declare that the father has the rights and responsibilities of a parent. The court's also required as a family court to deal with issues of enforcement of maintenance. How often do we hear the complaint, usually from the mother, that father's not sent me any money for X number of years? And we listen to those matters. We listen to applications from the Child Support Agency for enforcement of maintenance orders. But above all, we work with one of the statutory agencies, CAFCAS, to consider the child's wishes and feelings. What is it that they want to do if they are of sufficient age to know their own mind? And CAFCAS is a godsend to us, the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service. These are people who are trained social workers whose task is to determine what is best for the child and make recommendations to the family court. So they will meet with both parents, and above all, they will meet with the children and put in very lengthy reports to the court about what their recommendations are. You may understand that working in family court is an arena that you can either hack or you can't, because it can be very emotive indeed. Above Magistrates' Court, we have the Crown Court, and in Crown Court we hear appeals against conviction and appeals against sentence. And I just told you that I'm in the middle of one of those. It ranges from all sorts of things. I don't know if you can see the cartoon, the big beefy guy in the prison cell saying, "I'm in for murder, what about you?" And grandmother says, "Possession of a pressure cooker." It covers all sorts of range of things. Now, how many times have I sat in court with a defendant before me and thought to myself, why are they here? Why do they do it? Well, the reasons why people offend are manifold. Quite often it's motivated by greed. So often, and I asked a shoplifter this a few weeks ago, people steal the strangest things. And I asked them, why did you steal that? And all he could do was shrug his shoulders and say, I don't know. I have no idea. Quite often offenders are motivated by anger. Anger at life and anger at their lot in it. Anger at the unfairness of it all. And they steal and offend because somehow they think it's their right. Financial pressure is a huge pressure as well. And above all, alcohol and drugs are the biggest driver of offending. Time after time after time. I had a young man before me recently who got himself a new job. And he was so pleased with himself, he invited all his mates out for a drink. Now, he got a young wife and 2 little boys at home. And he got himself drunk and got into a fight. And I said to this guy, come on, tell me, how much do you think you drank that night? Now, bear in mind the nature of alcohol and its predisposition that it causes us to underestimate how much we've drunk. This guy looked at me and said, I think I only drank 15 pints. And I said, how much liquid does the human body hold? Does anybody know? I think it's about 7 or 8 pints. In other words, he tanked up at least twice, plus a bit more. So I looked at him and said, well, forgive me, I don't actually drink. How much is a pint? Well, he thought it was about 4 quid. So I said, you're telling me that you spent at least 60 quid that night of hard-earned money with a wife and young family at home to go and get totally out of your mind and you've ended up here. Does that say anything to you? And he admitted perhaps it wasn't the best idea of all. But alcohol and now drugs are the biggest driver of offending. Not just alcohol, we have a real problem now with the social consumption of what are deemed to be social drugs. Driving under the influence of drugs has become one of the biggest offences in this country right now. Be very careful. So, where are we? Yeah. Why do I do what I do? Well, you may well ask. It's a complicated business. I don't know why that's gone there, but never mind. Let me finish. I do this work as a magistrate, first of all, because I believe it's a job worth doing, and a job worth doing well. There are many days when Janet would tell you I come home and feel like putting my head through the wall at the stupidity of humanity and its hopelessness. But I also believe in the need for good justice. Justice is a slippery reality. What does it mean to do justice? It means doing what's right. But right for who? Remember that a magistrate is there to be a representative of the community. And guys, thank you for your support. Thank you for coming and listening today to this strange creature who does this strange thing. I try and limit it to one day a week because it's a very long day and a very arduous day. But I've done it all these years because I believe it's worth doing. And as a Christian, I also believe that justice must always be tempered with mercy. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that I have the power to let people off. It means that I must do according to my own conscience what's legal and right and true for the benefit of society and for the welfare of everyone, including the defendant. I frequently say to a defendant, I mean this in the nicest way possible, but I do so hope that we never meet again. That's why the courts exist, that's why probation exists, that's why magistrates exist. Because whilst we are there to pass sentence, and to pass the sentence of society on what someone has done, we are not there to pass sentence on people. Can I say that loudly and clearly? We are not there to judge people. We are there to judge what they have done. And that's an important Christian principle. Justice must always be tempered with mercy. There's a verse in the Old Testament that says this: what does the Lord require of you? God asks of us that we act justly, that we love mercy, and that we should walk humbly with our God. Even after 32 years, as I walk in the door, every day I get the collywobbles. And I pray simply, Lord, give me wisdom to do what's right and true. And finally, I do that because there, but for the grace of God, go you or I stand there and sit there as a member of a community to do what I believe God has asked me to do within that task. And I pray that I do it humbly, correctly, and mercifully and justly. The question is, before God, how do you plead? Thank you for listening.